Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. You know we love these things. You come to us with the curiosity, with the starting points, and we try to extract the juice, the real core insights. And today, you've sent us down a path that's pretty fascinating, really.
Yeah.
Exploring the potential, kind of like blue sky thinking here for pre-constructed theme decks in the upcoming, the highly anticipated Tools and Titans TCG.
Yeah, you're thinking about how Tools and Titans might approach those, ready-to-play decks right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Especially when we look at what some of the established giants like Pokémon and Yu-Gi-Oh, how they've tackled that same challenge.
Yeah.
And I think you're looking for that clear, insightful understanding, but without falling down the rabbit hole, right? You don't want to get lost in the weeds.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our mission today is to really dissect what those structural possibilities could look like for Tools and Titans from its very launch.
Absolutely, that's exactly it. And you've armed us with some fantastic material to dig into here, including details on how both Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh handle their pre-built offerings, and even a really cool analysis of like different potential theme deck frameworks for Tools and Titans, specifically taking into account its 9 distinct fashion types.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay, let's jump right in. When we think about these pre-constructed decks, ready-made decks in these like the big leagues of trading card games, what are some of the patterns? Where do we even begin to see like the common threads?
Well, one thing that we can always do is look at what has worked, right?
Yeah.
And I think taking Pokémon TCG as our first example, they're store-bought decks.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have several slightly different forms.
Yeah, okay.
You've got the classic theme decks, which are often now they call them battle decks,
right?
Which are really that entry point for new players.
Yeah.
Then you have league battle decks, which are kind of a step up in terms of competitiveness.
All right.
You have trainers toolkits. Or V-Battle decks, which are they give you more of the resources for actually customizing your own decks.
Okay.
And I noticed in the information you shared that Yu-Gi-Oh, they kind of go with a higher character count even in the starter decks.
Oh, interesting.
Which is a little bit of a hint at, maybe an emphasis on those monster interactions from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that's kind of a different approach to the way Pokemon starts, which is a little bit more balanced.
So almost like a tiered approach to the pre-built decks in the Pokemon.
Yeah.
What does one of those like, beginner kind of entry-level decks typically look like in terms of just its composition?
Yeah, so in a standard 60-card Pokemon theme deck, you'll typically find around 20 Pokemon cards.
Okay.
Now those are your characters, right? Your core characters. You've got roughly 25 trainer cards. Those are your items, your support effects.
Okay.
And then you have, about 15 energy cards.
Okay.
Which you use to power up your Pokemon's attacks.
And when we say around 20 Pokemon, what's the actual range that we tend to see in these decks?
Yeah, so I think typically it's about 16 to 22 Pokemon cards.
Okay.
For instance, I think you pointed to the Cinderace theme deck.
Yeah.
That one contains 16 Pokemon cards.
Okay.
And, they were featuring, obviously multiple copies of Cinderace, the main Pokemon.
Right.
Its evolutions, a couple other Pokemon to just kind of round out the theme.
Right. So focused on a few key Pokemon, kind of their evolutionary line.
Yeah.
Maybe some supporting creatures that fit that deck's strategy.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, shifting gears a little bit over to Yu-Gi-Oh, what does their pre-built deck landscape look like? What are the different kinds of products they offer?
So they have different types of pre-constructed decks.
Okay.
They have starter decks, which are very similar to Pokemon's theme decks, just the introductory.
Right.
And then they have what they call structure decks.
Okay.
They tend to be a little bit more focused on specific character archetypes.
Okay.
Or strategic play styles.
Right.
And then you also have things like legendary decks, which are, oftentimes they're collections of decks based around, some of the iconic characters from the anime.
Right.
And then they even have speed duel decks, which are actually those are designed for like a faster, streamlined version of the game.
Okay. Yeah. And what about the typical makeup of like a Yu-Gi-Oh structure deck?
Yeah.
How many of those monster cards, which are essentially their equivalent of the Pokemon characters, are we typically looking at?
Yeah, so a standard Yu-Gi-Oh structure deck usually contains 40 to 45 cards in what they call the main deck.
Okay.
Within that, you're typically going to see 20 to 25 monster cards.
Okay.
And then there's 10 to 15 spell cards, and then 5 to 10 trap cards. And what's interesting here is that many Yu-Gi-Oh decks also include an extra deck.
Ah, okay.
Which can hold Fusion, Synchro, XYZ, or Link monsters. Now these are additional character cards.
Oh, okay.
But they're summoned in a different way during the game.
Right.
So, this higher monster count combined with this extra deck, I think already tells you that, even at the pre-constructed level, Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of encouraging these complex monster interactions. It's more strategic summoning.
Right. That extra deck definitely adds another layer of complexity for sure.
Yeah.
So if we look at the Cyber Strike structure deck that you mentioned as an example, what was its monster card count?
That one had 21 monster cards in the main deck and 5 extra deck monsters.
Okay.
So yeah, you can see they tend to go with a higher number.
So a total of 26 character-based cards.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to kind of recap that first section, if you were picking up like an introductory pre-constructed deck, at the start of these games, you probably find somewhere between 16 and 22 main character cards in Pokemon.
Yeah.
And then around 20 to 25, maybe more with the extra deck in Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, that gives us a really good kind of foundation, a baseline to work with. So now let's kind of shift gears into part 2.
Yeah.
And this really intriguing thing, this perturbation mindset.
Yeah.
In the context of Tools and Titans and how they might approach these theme decks. What's the core idea behind that? When we say perturbation mindset, what are we really talking about?
So it's really about deliberately introducing elements that foster really dynamic and highly replayable experiences.
Okay.
So it's about thinking beyond just those obvious combinations.
Yeah.
Right. And exploring things like inversion.
Yeah.
Doing the unexpected or juxtaposition. Placing contrasting elements side by side.
Yeah.
So what if you had a deck that was pairing a really slow, powerful Tool Titan with, a swarm of really quick but weaker Rustborn.
Right.
Like that contrast creates some really interesting tactical choices for both players.
Yeah.
And then you also have asymmetry, where you might have one powerful card that's supported by a bunch of weaker ones.
Yeah.
You have dual tension. Like the inherent push and pull between different mechanics.
Okay.
And so it's about, it's not just about making unique decks. It's about kind of baking this inherent replayability and strategic depth into the very, very DNA of these pre-constructed experiences.
So they stay engaging for longer.
Exactly.
Than just the initial purchase.
Exactly.
That first couple plays. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So injecting that strategic decision making right from the start. You also mentioned rhythm shift.
And faction bleed.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those a little bit and how those fit in?
Yeah. So rhythm shift is about mechanics that kind of change the typical flow of the game. Okay. Right. So maybe it's by altering the number of actions that a player can take in a turn, or introducing an unexpected phase.
Oh, okay.
And then faction bleed is about strategically incorporating elements of one faction into another.
Okay.
And maybe in surprising ways.
Yeah.
Right? To create new synergies, to disrupt established strategies. So maybe a Tool Titan deck could surprisingly incorporate a Rustborn card that disrupts their opponent's resource.
Right.
And suddenly you're adding this new layer of strategy.
Yeah. And nonlinear goals, we haven't touched on that yet. What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so nonlinear goals are really about having those alternative ways to win the game. So beyond just simply defeating your opponent's, characters. Right.
So maybe it's completing a certain objective or achieving a certain condition.
Yeah.
Those are some of the ways.
Okay. That's really fascinating. And so, you've kind of given us this theoretical framework.
Yeah.
How does this relate to the actual 64 initial Tools and Titans characters across their 9 different faction types that you outlined for us?
So those 64 characters, you've got the Tool Titans, you've got the Green Six, you've got the Rustborn Trinity, Primordials, they're distributed across these factions.
Yeah.
That becomes the raw material for applying this perturbation mindset.
Okay.
Right? Because each of these factions has its own inherent flavor.
Yeah.
Thematic elements, potential mechanics, right?
Yeah.
And so, that allows for this huge, wealth of interesting combinations and contrasts when you're constructing these theme decks.
Okay. So you took this kind of diverse pool of characters, these different factions, and you identified 9 potential structural templates for Tools and Titans theme decks.
Yeah.
Let's explore those a little bit. Let's walk through a few of them. So, you started with the Mono Titan deck.
Yeah.
What's the thinking there?
So a Mono Titan deck would revolve around one single Titan character.
Okay.
A powerful Titan character.
Yeah.
And it would be supported by, a bunch of other cards, tools, tasks, whatever. Synergize with that Titan's abilities and play style.
Okay.
It's very similar to, how a lot of the introductory Pokemon decks are structured.
Right.
You have that featured Pokemon.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of cards that are designed to really enhance its strengths.
Right.
And I think, with 64 different characters to build around,
right.
You already have, 64 potential variations right there. So it's a great starting point, for beginner-friendly decks.
Very accessible way to kind of showcase individual characters.
Exactly.
Their strengths. Okay.
Yeah.
What about moving into something a little bit more intricate? So you mentioned faction pod decks.
Yeah.
What are those all about?
So faction pod decks, they feature a small group of 2 or 3 Titans from the same faction.
Okay.
Leveraging those inherent synergies within that thematic grouping.
Yeah.
So for instance, you could have, a pod of 3 Titans from the Green 6, the Tool Titans.
Yeah.
That, all of them have abilities that complement each other.
Right. Right.
So they really create kind of a cohesive strategic unit.
Yeah.
And we were thinking, based on how the characters could be grouped, effectively, we're looking at around 16 possible variations.
Okay.
For that type.
So building that synergy through small thematic groups.
Exactly.
Okay. Now you also outlined this dual deck structure, which immediately brings to mind Yu-Gi-Oh's starter decks.
Yes.
Often highlighting those iconic rivalries.
Yeah.
So what would a dual deck look like in Tools and Titans?
So a dual deck, or versus structure, as we've been calling it, it would directly pit 2 opposing factions.
Okay.
Or even specific characters against each other.
Right.
And it would likely emphasize a narrative conflict, from the game's lore.
Right. Yeah.
You brought up the great example of Voltara versus Chivalry.
Yeah.
Right. That's a classic clash of charging power versus draining tactics.
Right. Yeah.
And we were thinking, at least 15, 20 really compelling pairings could be built around this.
Right.
Based on those lore-rich matchups.
Yeah. So a really balanced and thematically resonant play experience right out of the box.
Exactly.
I really like the idea of kind of weaving that story, game's narrative, directly into those pre-constructed decks. Now, what about the hybrid paradox deck?
Yeah.
That sounds particularly intriguing because it hints at that perturbation.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Yeah, so this type of deck, it would strategically blend a Titan from one faction with a Rustborn character.
Okay.
And potentially even incorporate, tasks that have like dual identities or effects.
Okay. Depending
on which side of the conflict is being emphasized.
Okay.
And this allows for really interesting fail-forward mechanics.
Right.
And directly explores that central tension between, the technologically advanced Tool Titans and the resource-devouring Rustborn,
Mm-hmm.
And so we envisioned, maybe 10, 15 variations around this theme, of corruption and potential redemption.
Okay.
Especially when you consider the minor Titans and the Kuro characters.
Yeah. Right.
Imagine a Titan whose power is actually amplified by corrupted energy.
Right.
So it's alongside this Rustborn character who benefits from the depletion of resources.
Right. It's a huge risk-reward dynamic.
Huge risk-reward. And it really kind of emphasizes that perturbation.
Yeah. But we're really starting to see how this mindset can lead to some really unique and the strategically deep deck structures. Yeah. You also mentioned minor Titan decks and primordial influence decks.
Yes.
What are the core concepts behind those?
So minor Titan decks, they would focus on a pair of minor Titans.
Okay.
supported by a single, a single tool or Rustborn Titan.
Okay.
And these could really emphasize, unique support mechanics.
Okay.
Or even some of those perturbation strategies we're talking about. Maybe things like zone linking.
Okay.
Or really interesting card draw effects that leverage, the minor Titan's unique characteristics.
Right.
So we saw, maybe 10, 20 variations there. And then primordial influence decks, on the other hand, would pair, a Titan with one of those really powerful primordial characters.
Okay.
And potentially even alter some of the game's fundamental mechanics.
Wow.
In the process. So we're talking at least, 13 variations.
Okay.
Just based on the number of primordials.
So altering core mechanics right in a theme deck.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a bold choice.
It's bold.
I mean, what kind of impact do you think that would have on a new player's understanding of the game's fundamental rules if you're kind of playing around with those so much right out of the gate?
It is a bold move.
Yeah.
It's really leaning into that idea and shaking things up.
Yeah. Okay. You also had on the list this Karot monster deck.
Yeah.
What's the angle there? What's that all about?
Yeah, so the Karot monster deck is envisioned more for a player versus environment kind of style of gameplay.
Okay.
Or maybe even a dungeon crawl.
Okay.
So it would feature one or two Karot monsters alongside tools that have been corrupted by the Rustborn influence.
Right.
It might even introduce alternative mechanics like replacing cast with something like Scorch.
Okay.
To further differentiate.
So really kind of changing up that gameplay experience.
Yeah.
Offering a very different way to engage with the game.
Yeah.
And so how many variations are we looking at potentially with a deck type like that?
Probably 10 or more.
Okay.
Focusing on that PvE.
Yeah. That sounds like a really cool way to onboard players who enjoy those solo or cooperative experiences.
Exactly.
Right from the start. So it's offering a very different kind of entry point than just the head-to-head competitive focus.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got just a couple more of these structural templates to kind of cover here.
Yeah.
So the Shrine or Task Goal decks and the Weavebreaker Disruption decks.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about those.
So the Shrine or Task Goal decks, they're really about achieving victory through specific card effects.
Okay.
Or by completing a series of tasks.
Right.
Rather than just, solely through direct combat.
Okay, so not just defeating all your opponent's Titans.
Right.
Okay.
It's more about, think of it like the Exodia condition in Yu-Gi-Oh.
Right.
Right. You have this specific set of cards that lead to this alternative win.
Right.
And these would probably be, more specialized builds, maybe 6 to 8 that focus on those unique win conditions. And then finally, the Weavebreaker Disruption decks, they're all about, hindering your opponent.
Okay.
Right. Disrupting their strategy by disrupting their tasks or their weave.
Right.
Which I understand is like, it's a key resource or a mechanic in Tools and Titans.
Right.
And these decks would likely lean heavily on, Rustborn, Denizen, or even primordial characters with abilities that are just geared towards sabotage and control.
Okay.
So we figured there's probably, 5, maybe 10 variations there.
Right. Building on this idea of like the thematic pairings with those faction pod decks, you also had that dual deck concept, which seems to take that rivalry a step further by really kind of...
Yeah, those pairings would be very specific.
Yeah.
To maximize that tension.
Okay. That's a huge amount of potential.
It is.
Right out of the gate. And if we add up all of those estimated variations across these 9 structural templates.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of total number are we looking at?
Well, based on our analysis, by combining all of those approaches, Tools and Titans TCG could potentially launch with over 176 unique theme deck structures.
Wow.
Now, to be clear, that's not 176 fully realized distinct decks, right?
Right.
But it just goes to show you the incredibly rich design space that's available just by considering how those initial 64 characters, their factions, how they can be combined, how their mechanics can be perturbed to create these diverse play experiences.
Right. Yeah. That's a huge, a truly staggering number of possibilities.
It is.
It really underscores that modularity that you were talking about earlier. Okay, so let's shift gears one more time into part 3. So how does this potential for such a wide array of theme deck structures, how does that align with what we actually saw from Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, back in the day when they launched?
Yeah, that's a key question.
Yeah.
Because, having the potential for that vast number of deck structure is great.
Yeah.
Long-term replayability,
right,
player engagement, it's all fantastic.
Right.
But that initial launch needs to be strategically focused and manageable for new players.
Right.
Right. So when Pokemon TCG first came on the scene, 1999, with its base set, it launched with just 2 theme decks.
Okay.
Brushfire, which focused on the fire and grass type Pokemon, and Zap, which was centered around electric and water.
Okay.
And I think the philosophy there was really to introduce those basic game rules, that type synergy, in a really balanced and easy to understand way.
Right.
For newcomers. Now, they did quickly follow up.
Okay.
They added 4 more decks within the first 9 months.
Okay.
But initially it was just those 2.
Okay. It's really interesting that both Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh started with just 2 decks.
Yeah.
What do you think were the key considerations that drove that initial limited offering? Was it about, simplicity for new players? Was it cost considerations? Was it about ensuring a balanced kind of initial metagame?
I mean, it could have been a combination of all those factors.
Yeah.
But you're right, that balance between exciting potential and that accessible entry point is critical.
Yeah. Oh, so a very focused initial offering for Pokemon. What about Yu-Gi-Oh when it launched back in 2002?
Yeah, so they also started with just 2 pre-constructed products.
Okay.
But they call them starter decks. So starter deck, Yugi, and starter deck.
Okay.
And they weren't as thematically tied to specific card types.
Okay.
As Pokemon's initial decks.
Yeah.
Instead, they focused on the rivalry between Yugi and Kaiba, the main characters from the anime.
Right.
And they really showcased just fundamental monster, spell, and trap card interactions.
Okay.
And it's worth noting that those more tightly themed structure decks, the ones that focus on specific archetypes and strategies, those actually came a bit later in their product life cycle.
Okay.
Around 2004.
Okay. So both games went with a very streamlined initial offering of just 2 introductory products.
Yeah.
Albeit with kind of slightly different foundational philosophies, right?
Exactly.
Type synergy for Pokemon, character rivalry for Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yep.
So how can Tools and Titans potentially learn from these initial strategies?
Yeah.
Especially when we think about its, inherent kind of perturbation mindset.
Yeah, I think Tools and Titans is in a really interesting position.
Yeah.
They could effectively mirror either of those initial approaches.
Okay.
So they could choose to launch with 2 opposing mechanic or philosophy decks, much like Pokemon did.
Okay.
So you mentioned earlier Voltara versus Chivalry.
Right.
Charge versus Drain.
Yeah.
Or Verdesia versus Nullspore. Renewal versus Corruption.